They thought she wouldn't fight back because she couldn't speak. In a courtroom full of whispers and glares, the young girl stood barefoot, hands trembling, lips sealed not by choice but by birth. Her silence echoed louder than the slams of the judge's gavel. No one noticed her torn shawl, or how she clutched her mother's Bible like it held the last piece of her broken voice. They only saw her as a burden mute, ragged and alone. And they laughed, until one man rose from the backbench's stranger in a tailored buffalo hide coat. Eyes dark as the prairie night, tanned with a nod, the silence began to bloom into something no one in that court would forget. Her name was Calla, found beside a frostbitten creek at age 6. She had survived with nothing but a burnt locket and a throat that had never formed words. Locals called her Whisper Girl and fed her when they remembered. She swept church steps, stitched buttons for a penny, and once tended a dying man's wounds just by holding his hand through the night. People pitied her until they got bored. Then they passed her by like a shadow. But one day, fate dragged her into the center of town justice. A wealthy rancher had accused Calla of stealing, not livestock, not gold, but something far worse, in their eyes, his late wife's wedding ring. He claimed he saw her kneeling by the rose bush near the widow's grave where the ring had vanished. Calla, unable to defend herself, could only point to the wildflowers in her pouch, the real reason she had been there. But no one listened. They jeered. The prosecutor called her a silent thief, spinning tales with slick charm and a cruel grin. He joked that maybe she sold stolen goods to buy herself a new voice. The townspeople laughed. The judge rolled his eyes. The gavel prepared to fall. But then, from the shadows of the courtroom, boots struck the wooden floor like thunder. A tall Comanche man, hair bound in silver cord, stepped forward. He was unknown to many, feared by some, and wealthier than all. That man was Tahoma Grayson, owner of the largest trading line west of the Rockies, and a name that carried power, from New Mexico to Kansas. He said nothing as he approached, yet the room fell silent. For once, silence carried more weight than words. Calla lifted her head. She didn't know the man, but he looked at her the way no one ever had. Not with pity, not with suspicion, but with recognition, like he had seen her somewhere before, perhaps in a pain he once carried himself. The judge hesitated. The prosecutor blinked, and the Comanche Tycoon placed something on the table. It wasn't money. It was a sheet of parchmentan old land deed. Calla's name was on it. The courtroom burst into confusion, but no one dared speak over the man who still hadn't said a word. When Tahoma finally did speak, his voice wasn't loud, but it was final, and it was enough to turn the case upside down. That day didn't just begin Calla's redemption. It revealed the corruption of the courtroom, the poison in the ranchers, accusations, and the truth behind her pasted truth buried under dust. Silence and blood. What secret did he uncover that tied his empire to a voiceless girl in a torn shawl? And why did her silence feel like it carried the weight of generations? Don't blink, because in the next part, the courtroom's whispers will reach the frontier's edge, and what they find there might just burn everything they thought they knew to the ground. The judge's hands shook as he examined the paper. A legal land deed, signed in frontier ink, dated 15 years earlier. On it, the name Calla. May Whitlock was etched in cursive alongside the seal of one of the oldest homesteads in Redwood County. The deed said the land had been entrusted to her mother before her death, and now, to Calla, the mute girl, the town had discarded. Shock rippled through the room like wildfire on prairie grass. The rancher who'd accused her turned pale. His lie had just unraveled in front of the entire court, and yet no one dared look him in the eye. Whispers cracked like dry branches. What was Calla doing with a deed? Who had kept it hidden? Why hadn't she known about it? But one man did know, Tahoma Grayson. Long before he became a legend, Tahoma had been a messenger boy, delivering supplies, 2 distant farmsteads on horseback. He had once stopped at a homestead owned by a widow named Grace Whitlock, who'd been raising her infant daughter alone after her husband died in a mine collapse. That girl, barely walking, had tried to hand him a sunflower wrapped in string. Tahoma never forgot the moment, or the mother's eyes that carried the weight of grief, yet refused to harden years later. After rising through the ranks of trade and politics, he returned to that same homestead only to find it burned to the ground, the land quietly seized. by a neighboring rancher who claimed the widow owed debts she never made. He tried to contest it, but found the courthouse files conveniently missing. The child was never found. Only a scorched Bible and a melted locket in the ash. But fate is strange on the frontier. Tahoma had kept a copy of the deed Grace once handed him for delivery, a backup she asked him to store in case silence ever becomes her only voice. And now, that silence had grown loud enough to shake a courtroom. The judge recessed in confusion. The case, once open manshot, was now an open wound, bleeding questions. The crowd spilled out into the street, some muttering apologies, others too ashamed to meet Cala's eyes. Yet she stood still, her face unreadable, her hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of something deeper. Vindication.Tahoma didn't linger. He stepped out quietly and waited beneath the shade of an ironwood tree, arms crossed, eyes watching the horizon. Cala approached, holding the deed like it was still too heavy for her fingers. She looked up at him, and he simply nodded once, then turned toward the west. What came next would never be recorded in court transcripts. No gavel would fall, no lawyer would argue, because what awaited them both was not just a return to the land, but a return to the truth buried beneath it. For behind the false accusation was a darker motive. The rancher who had accused her didn't just want her silenced, he wanted her erased. That land wasn't just valuable lit, was rich with something deeper than gold. And Cala, though she couldn't speak, was now the only rightful heir. She would go back to that land, but she wouldn't go alone, because somewhere in the hills of her family's forgotten homestead, something lay waiting, a secret long buried, a danger long watching, and a man willing to burn justice itself to keep it hidden. Cala's silence had been mocked in court, but now her very existence was a threat, and Tahoma Grayson, with all his wealth and mystery, had just made himself her shield. 3 days after the trial, the wagon wheels creaked against a familiar road Tahoma hadn't ridden in decades, and beside him sat Cala, eyes wide as the open sky, her fingers clutching the deed like it was stitched into her bones. The journey westward was quiet, but not empty. The wind spoke in whispers across the canyon ridges, and even the birds seemed to fly in silence. When they arrived, the land didn't welcome them with warmth. It stared back like a ghost waiting to be acknowledged. The homestead was gone, replaced by weeds and the splintered remains of what once had walls, but the iron gate still stood. On it, a rusted W curled in the center, half swallowed by vines. Cala reached for it slowly, brushing away the overgrowth with shaking hands. And then she knelt. There, hidden in the dirt where roses once bloomed, was a stone. Not a grave, no name etched, no flowers left, but its placement was deliberate. Tahoma dismounted and approached, watching as she pressed her hand over it. Her shoulders trembled, not from cold, but from memory she never had. Yet somehow, always carried Tahoma, walked the land's perimeter, remembering the fences, the livestock paths, the way the widow Whitlock would wave as he rode past. He stopped by a ridge overlooking the lower meadow and pointed. Cala followed his gaze and saw a faint glimmer just beneath the grass, a corner of metal they dug for hours. The sun dipped low, and when the final layer was swept away, a chest emerged, larger than a footlocker, sealed in leather and brass. Inside it lay letters, a journal, an old brooch, a pressed sunflower, and finally, a birth certificate. Cala May Whitlock, born to Grace and Harlan Whitlock. Date, April 17th. She was only 2 months old when her father died. Her mother's letters, written by candlelight, spoke of fears, debts, and the stranger in town, the same rancher, who now stood exposed in court pressuring her to sell the land. When she refused, the threats grew. The letters grew darker then. They stopped. Cala stood motionless. She could not weep, not the way others did. Her throat didn't allow it. But a sound came, a breathless gasp, a quiet exhale that spoke of loss too deep for words. She reached into the chest and pulled out a final envelope. On it, for when she is old enough to know. Inside was a map, not to gold, not to oil, but to something older. A buried spring once used by the native tribes, now covered and forgotten. It was a source of healing, of life, and of power. One her mother had vowed to protect. Tahoma stood over her shoulder, eyes scanning the hills. That spring wasn't just sacred to the land, it was valuable. more than Kala could imagine, and if the wrong people knew she had found it, they wouldn't come for the land again. They would come for her. That night, Tahoma made a fire under the stars. Kala sat near the chest, rereading her mother's journal by firelight, tracing every curve of her mother's words like a daughter learning her own story for the first time. Tahoma placed a protective charm beside her, crafted by his own grandmother. He said nothing but his silence, like hers, was a vow, because someone had tried to erase her. But now the land remembered, and redemption had begun. The spring was deeper than the map suggested, hidden under layers of rock and time. It sat nestled between two broken cedar trunks, water, pure as glass, humming with a pulse that felt alive. Kala stepped toward it barefoot, her toes sinking into cool earth. For the first time, she felt something echo in her chest, not a voice, but a calling. She had no words to speak it, but the land understood her. Tahoma watched from the ridge above, hands on his belt, senses trained to the wind. He didn't like the silence, not this kind. It wasn't Kala's silence. This was the stillness of men watching in shadows. He'd seen it before ambush, before betrayal, before violence dressed in law. They came at sundown. Riders. 6. Of them, all under the rancher's pay. They didn't knock on the cabin door. They kicked it open, but Kala wasn't inside. She had gone to the spring before dusk and stayed there with the journal. Tahoma had warned her never to be alone, but she hadn't wanted to disturb his rest. She thought the land would protect her. She hadn't learned yet that the land may remember, but men forget mercy when they found the cabin empty. They tore it apart, floorboards split, windows shattered. The Chescone Tahoma had hidden it earlier, trusting his instincts. But the map, it was still in her SATCHEL by the time Kala heard them. It was too late to run, but she didn't. Instead, she crouched beside the spring, eyes wide, clutching the journal and the map. Her hands shook, but her feet did not move. The men's torches flickered over the ridge. One of them shouted. Another cocked his rifle. And then came a sound none of them expected: hooves in full gallop. Not from the road, from the trees. Tahoma exploded from the underbrush, like a shadow on fire. His rifle barked once, then twice, not to kill but to warn. He didn't believe in blood unless blood was drawn first. The horses scattered. One man dropped his torch. Another fell from his saddle and scrambled toward the trees. But the biggest of them, the rancher's foreman, lunged at Tahoma with a knife. Kala watched, frozen, as the two men collided. She could not scream, could not cry for help. But something ancient moved through her. Her fingers clenched. The charm Tahoma had left. Her heart pounded like a drum. She stood, and then she ran, not away but toward the fight. The foreman slammed Tahoma into the rocks. Blood bloomed at the corner of the Tycoon's mouth. The knife raised until Kala threw her satchel. It hit the man's hand, and the blade slipped from his fingers. In that single moment of confusion, Tahoma struck. The foreman crumpled. They didn't kill him, but they left him tied to the tree, where the spring flowed beside him, forced to watch as Kala poured fresh water onto the roots and reclaimed what had always been hers. By morning, the land was no longer silent. It had chosen her, but the danger hadn't ended. Word spread fast on the frontier, and men who lose to the truth do not retreat, they conspire. In the distance, the rancher sharpened more than lies, and a judge with a price on his conscience signed a warrant without even reading the name. Kala had found her voice in the water. Now they were coming to drown it. They didn't wait long to strike. Less than a week after the ambush, the warrant came written in ink, but dripping in betrayal. It accused Kala of trespassing, obstruction, and unlawful possession of ancestral land. A parade of fabricated charges meant to strangle her under paper and signature. This wasn't about the law. It was about reclaiming control. They marched into the valley at dawn. Deputies, surveyors, and two men with rifles, too polished for their purpose. They thought Kala would run again, but when they reached the ridge, they found her already waiting, dressed in her mother's patched shawl, the deed tucked into her skirt. Kala did not flinch. Tahoma stood beside her like a living statue, arms folded, face unreadable. They surrendered peacefully, not because they were afraid, but because this time the battle needed to be seen. The courtroom was more crowded than ever, the same benches, that once held whispering merchants and smirking townsfolk, now trembled under the weight of something different out. The judge kept his voice cold, trying to mask the sweat under his collar, and Calla, seated once again in silence, felt her hands shake, but only for a moment. Then something changed. Tahoma stepped forward, not as a witness, not as a bodyguard, but as a claimant. He revealed everything: the forged documents, the missing case files, the fire that had no official report, and most damning of all, the copy of the original map. Notarized by a tribal council elder years before, Calla was even accused. The court murmured. The rancher's lawyer tried to object, but Tahoma's words cut deeper than any gavel. He spoke of how this town thrived by erasing people like Calla people, without voices, without wealth, without protection. He pointed out the judge's own ties to the land committee and the suspicious funding behind the courthouse's recent renovation. Every name he spoke dripped with guilt. Every detail he recalled matched public records. He hadn't come just to defend a girl. He'd come to expose an empire built on silence. Then, in the most dramatic moment of the trial, Tahoma laid down a final parchment, a sealed affidavit, written long ago by a woman named Grace Whitlock. It named her daughter the Spring, and the threat she feared most, that the land would be stolen by those wearing law as a mask. The courtroom cracked like glass. The judge recessed with no word. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't breathe. Some left with heads bowed. Others stayed silent, watching the girl who said nothing but whose presence now roared louder than any man in that room outside. Under a cloud-streaked sky, Calla stood in the same spot where she had once trembled. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just reached into her shawl and pulled out her mother's journal, flipping to the last page. There, in faded ink, were the words, "If she cannot speak for herself, let the land speak for her, and may it never forget whose blood watered its roots." The land had spoken. The court would never forget. But it wasn't over, because redemption is not won in one battle. It's forged over generations. They never announced the verdict out loud. It arrived quietly, just as Calla had unfolded on paper. Signed in the judge's trembling hand, pinned to the courthouse door before sunrise. It stated, in exact words, that the land belonged to Calla May Whitlock by right of blood, law, and inheritance. It nullified the rancher's claim, revoked the previous surveyor's map, and ordered restitution for damages. Though Calla would never collect it, her justice wasn't measured in dollars. It bloomed in deeper soil. The rancher vanished that same night, packed his bags, left no address. Rumors said he moved east, tried to buy land in a mining town, but no one trusted a man whose lies had been read in court. The judge retired early, citing health. The town's silence remained, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was reverent. Calla never returned to the courtroom. She didn't need to. Instead, she built a garden on the land where her home once stood. Wildflowers lined the spring's edge. Sunflowers tilted toward the wind, and in the center stood a single iron gate truss cleaned, vines trimmed, and the W glinting again in the sunlight. The deed stayed in a wooden box beneath a cedar tree, wrapped in her mother's shawl, guarded not by locks but by memory. Tahoma stayed for weeks after the trial, helping build a new cabin with his own hands. He said little, but every beam he raised, every nail he struck, was a word she never had to speak. When it was done, he left a satchel by her door inside, a leather-bound book with blank pages. Calla began to write, not with her voice, but with her hands. Each page held memories. Of her mother, moments with Tahoma, drawings of wildflowers, maps of the land. She called the book The Garden of Silence, and in time, children from the town began to visit. At first, they came to see the spring, then to listen to her stories and pictures, then to help her plant. One day, a girl named Ruth asked why she never spoke. Calla didn't answer. She just handed Ruth a flower, and the child understood. Word spread. The land once fought over now flourished. People came not to take, but to learn. They asked her to teach them how to listen to soil, to silence, to each other. The mayor renamed the trail to the Ridge, Whitlock Way. The spring was registered as a protected heritage site. And once a year, on the date of her court trial, Calla walked barefoot through town with a wreath of sunflowers and left it at the old courthouse steps. No protests, no speeches. Just a tribute, a reminder that the quietest among us sometimes carry the heaviest truths. Tahoma returned only once more, years later. His hair had grayed, but his steps were steady. He brought a wooden plaque. Together, they placed it beside the garden gate. It read, "Redemption doesn't come in thunder. It grows in silence." As he rode away one last time, Kala stood at the gate, holding the journal close. A wind passed through the fields, rustling the flowers, brushing her shawl, and for a moment, just a moment, the land seemed to whisper her name. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Echoes of Frontier Redemption for more powerful tales where silence speaks and justice rides through the dust. Your support helps us bring forgotten voices back to life.